Hello, my dear friends. Some words for Parshas Vayigash. One of the great difficulties for the person of faith is trying to figure out, particularly during times of adversity, when one should resign themselves to their current fate, to chalk things up to God's will, versus when the person should fight to change their current state and not accept the status quo. There are countless examples in life when one receives a terminal illness diagnosis, chas v'shalom. Should they accept their fate and let things happen naturally, or should they fight the disease tooth and nail? When one is faced with opposition in their job or their marriage, when should they fight to stay, and when should they just walk away? When the government tries to shut down religious services or small businesses during a pandemic, when should a community quietly accept the rules, and when should they try to fight for their rights in the courts? It's not easy knowing whether it's better to be passive and accept that this is Hashem's will, or whether Hashem has presented us with a challenge because he wants us to take the bull by the horns and push back. This challenging dichotomy in all of our lives is one way of portraying the two names that our patriarch Yaakov possessed. He was both Yaakov and Yisrael. He was the son of Yitzchak, who was generally passive and accepting of everything in life as being God's will. But he was also the grandson of Avraham, who forged his own unique path by breaking stride with his entire family and society. Yaakov contained both his grandfather's and his father's personalities within him. There were times when he was Yaakov and accepted the circumstances of his life and made the best of them. But there were times that he was Yisrael, who took control of the situation instead of allowing the situation to control him. When we look at the entire Yosef story, starting in Parshas Vayeshev, the name Yisrael is used very sparingly when compared to the more common name Yaakov. We find that at this stage in his life, Yaakov wasn't interested in affecting the people around him as a father and a husband in the same way that he had in previous chapters of his life. He was getting older, and he wanted to live an uncomplicated and passive life. The only time in Parshas Vayeshev where Yaakov is called Yisrael is in that very short episode when he sends Yosef to seek out his brothers who were shepherding in the town of Shechem. This was the only time when Yaakov actively attempted to engineer a peace and a better relationship between Yosef and his brothers, which, as we know from the story, ended up backfiring. In Parshas Miketz, last week's Parsha, the only time Yaakov is identified as Yisrael is when he decisively tells his sons what to take with them when bringing their brother Binyamin down to Egypt. This is the brave fighter, Yisrael, who, while facing the adversity of having to part with his beloved son Binyamin, acts decisively and strategically in the hopes of garnering the best results. And now, after discovering that his son Yosef is still alive, we find the name Yisrael in our Parsha appearing more prominently. We once again find the Yisrael who has regained the eye of the tiger when deciding to travel to Egypt and see his son. So in chapter 45 it says, Vayomer Yisrael, that Israel says, Rav od Yosef ben Ich. I'll take the bull by the horns and I will travel down to Egypt. And the Torah says, Vayisa Yisrael v'chol, that Yisrael, the mighty Yisrael, the strong Yisrael, goes down with his entire family. It is thus so bizarre when on the journey to Egypt, when Hashem finally appears to Yaakov in a dream after so many years, the Torah juxtaposes the two names. In reassuring Yaakov that God will be with him, his children during their Egyptian sojourn, Hashem prefaces the statement with, Vayomer Elokim liYisrael, God speaks to Israel, the strong Israel, Bimarot halayla, in a vision of the night. Vayomer Yaakov Yaakov. He says, Jacob, Jacob. The narrator identifies God as addressing Yisrael, the man of decision and action. Yet Hashem then calls out to him as Yaakov, Yaakov. If he was acting as Yisrael, why did Hashem say Yisrael, Yisrael? I believe that Hashem's call to Yaakov was not just an opening welcome to his old friend. It was a commandment. Hashem was telling him, You have now returned, thank God, to your eyes as Yisrael, the strong fighter. That persona has served you well, just as it serves you well now, as you prepare for your children and your children's future in Egypt. But once you arrive in Egypt, you will need to suppress that Yisrael persona. Once in the exile, you must keep your head low and allow things to happen to you and your family. Be Yaakov. Don't fight, and don't try to change what happens all around you. Your purpose in being in Egypt is to be passive and to allow the Egyptian exile to envelop you and your descendants, so that in the end you emerge as the transformed people that I, God, have been planning for all along. I believe that this message wasn't only conveyed by Hashem, but was also alluded to himself when Yosef first sent for his father to come down to Egypt. Note that the word agalot, or wagons, transporting all from Egypt, and also being used to fetch Yaakov and his entire family to Egypt, plays a significant role in describing how Yosef transport everyone. It was only when Yaakov saw Yosef's agalot that his spirit was revived. Why couldn't Yaakov and his family just simply transport themselves? The message to Yaakov was that just as when you are riding in a wagon, you are a passive passenger, so will be your sojourn in Egypt. You will be a passenger, dear father. Egypt. You will not be the driver of the vehicle that brings you to both slavery and to redemption. We can now better understand how Yaakov behaves when he first meets Paro. Having duly received the message from both his son and from God, Yaakov understands his role. He makes himself into a completely, allowing Yosef to schlep him around to meet Paro, as the pasuk says, "Vayave Yosef et Yaakov aviv," that Yosef brought his father Yaakov and stood him up in front of Paro. Is this the same man who had wrestled with an angel? No. The man who wrestled with an angel was Yisrael, but the guise that he needed to assume now was that of the passive Yaakov, who accepts his current situation, who smiles at his new king, and who even offers his blessings to this king, despite the knowledge of what evil is yet to come. When meeting Yaakov, Paro's first question to him was, "How old are you?" Kama yemei shemei chayecha. Yaakov's response was to downplay the quality of his life. He told Paro, "I'm 130 years old, but ma'at v'ra'im, that my life has not been a particularly good one, and that I haven't lived as long as my parents or grandparents." Why respond in such a dour way? Paro may have been shocked to meet such an old man, since, as anthropologists observe, old age was such a rarity in ancient Egypt. But it's also possible that Paro wanted to make sure that Yaakov wouldn't present trouble for him. A revered elder, indeed Yosef's father, might garner more respect from the general populace than even Paro himself. But Yaakov understood his place and his new role. He downplayed whom he was and presented himself as a broken man. "I used to be a Yisrael, but I'm just a Yaakov now. You have nothing to fear from me." Yaakov's behavior paved the way for a smooth transition for the Jewish people into Golus. And here we are today, still in the midst of a pandemic. I can't help but feel like we're all more like Yaakov than Yisrael. Every day seems like the last, the same restrictions, the same lockdown, the same sense that we cannot do what we want to really do, that we are not in control of our environment, but it is rather our environment that controls us. But is that bad? Not necessarily. We all possess this duality in our lives of sometimes being the affector and sometimes the affected. Those of us who are parents realize that we need to influence our children and require them to conform to certain behaviors so that they will grow up properly. It is only when they mature that we can give them more space and allow them to become the Yisrael instead of the Yaakov. In loving relationships, people alternate all the time between the Yaakov and Yisrael persona. When one is in the process of undergoing transformation, one needs to remain passive for a while, just as a caterpillar enters into its cocoon and lies dormant so that it can emerge as a butterfly. So must we occasionally allow ourselves to be affected instead of being affectors. God has his reasons, just as he had his reasons for placing the Jewish people in the cocoon of Egypt for 400 years. Thank God the cocoon of COVID looks like it's not going to last that much more than a year. But it's up to us to allow the transformation to take place so that when it's time for us to emerge on the other end, we will be able to once again assume the mantle of Yisrael and make our impression upon the world. May we see that moment of redemption when we are part of the positive change in the world all around us. Let's see it b'mheira b'yameinu, amen. And here's wishing you a beautiful, peaceful Shabbos.